As we learned in the previous lesson, when you're analyzing word choice, you're mainly looking for connotative meanings of the words and phrases used, whether that's individual uses of words or phrases, the way words and phrases are used to create imagery or in figurative language, what have you. You're looking for connotative meanings and how that enhances the rhetoric of the text. When you're analyzing elements of word arrangement, you're mainly looking for where the audience's attention is drawn. And that's because the way in which we construct sentences can kind of manipulate the focus of that sentence and the ideas that are emphasized because of that arrangement. So here are the three big things you need to look for when looking for elements of word arrangement. You should look for repetition, parallel construction, and any unusual coordinate series. Let's start by talking about repetition, which is just any repetition of a word, phrase, clause, or even whole sentences within a text. Repetition draws attention to, well, the idea that's being repeated, and it's used to add emphasis to those ideas. There are a number of different special forms of repetition that you may have heard of before. These are some of those rhetorical devices that have the Greek names. The first one is anaphora, which is repetition that occurs at the beginning of successive syntactic structures. Epistrophe is repetition at the end of successive syntactic structures. Symplosi is a combination of anaphora and epistrophe. It's repetition that occurs at the beginning and the end of successive syntactic structures, and it's pretty rare. Anadiplosis, which is a word or phrase that a word or phrase that occurs at the end of one syntactic unit that is then repeated at the beginning of the next syntactic unit, sort of an inside-out repetition. And then finally, aponalepsis, which is where you have a word or phrase at the beginning of one syntactic unit that is repeated at the end of the next syntactic unit, a sort of outside-in repetition. Go ahead and pause the video at this time to complete part A of the practice activity, where you're asked to practice identifying and explaining some examples of repetition in a text. In addition to repetition, you should also look for parallel structure. Parallel structure exists when you have successive phrases, clauses, or even entire sentences that contain the same syntactic parts in the same order. Parallel construction draws attention to the various corresponding ideas within those parallel structures. Yeah, just like you have corresponding points along parallel lines in geometry, you have corresponding ideas within parallel syntactic units. And the parallel structure works to emphasize the relationships between those ideas, either by clearly drawing distinctions between them if they're opposites, or by just clearly showing what other relationships they have. Here are some examples of sentences that feature parallel construction. The manor, designed for beauty and grace, built for durability and strength, and located for privacy and safety, was the ideal home for those three children. Here we've got a series of participial phrases in the middle of our sentence here, three different participial phrases that are parallel because each one repeats the same structure. We've got a participle followed by a prepositional phrase, and that prepositional phrase contains a compound object. So we have designed, built, located, for beauty and grace, for durability and strength, for privacy and safety. Those are our corresponding ideas. In the second sentence, I had been short and now I was tall. I had been skinny and quiet and religious and now I was good-looking and muscular. Here we have a number of different corresponding ideas, and they're serving here to kind of emphasize opposites, kind of emphasize the differences in what was then and what is now the case. In addition to parallel structure, also be on the lookout for chiastic structure. Chiastic structure is inverted parallelism. We also call it chiasmus. That's the name of the device. Chiasmus occurs when you have successive phrases, clauses, or entire sentences that contain the same syntactic parts, but in opposite or inverted order. Yeah, it has the exact same stylistic effects as parallel structure. It draws attention to those corresponding ideas. It emphasizes the relationships between those ideas. It just does so in kind of an unexpected way because parallel structure is way more common. When we see something written in chiastic structure in that sort of inverted way, it jumps out at us, and it's kind of refreshing to see. Here then are some examples of chiastic structure. I have journeyed in the lands of the Spirit, drunk from the fountains of wisdom, rested beneath the trees of eternity, and to the land of my birth I have returned. That's chiastic because the last unit in that series changes the order of the syntactic parts. The first three begin with a participle and continue with a prepositional phrase, whereas the last one begins with the prepositional phrase and finishes with the participle. Another example in the second sentence there, in his face divine compassion visibly appeared, love without end and without measure grace. Yeah, it sounds really pleasant there. It's because it's still creating a similar sounding rhythm, but the inversion there is kind of refreshing. Finally, along with parallelism and chiasmus, also be on the lookout for antithesis, which is the use of parallel or chiastic structure to distinguish opposite ideas. Antithesis is just a special type of parallel and chiastic structure that draws attention to contrasting ideas specifically by clearly juxtaposing those ideas in close proximity to one another. All right, let's go ahead and pause this video to complete part B of the practice activity. We're going to be practicing identifying and explaining examples of parallel structure in a text, and there is a lot in here. So look for parallel structure and look especially for examples of antithesis that features that parallel construction. So in addition to repetition and parallel structure, finally also look at any unusual coordinate series in the text. Coordinate series is a grammatical term meaning a list of words, phrases, or clauses that are joined by a coordinating conjunction. And in a coordinate series, we can really only use and or. We can't really use any of the other coordinating conjunctions in a list. Long coordinate series, that is, series that contain 5 or more units, typically draw attention to themselves by emphasizing the number of things being listed. Yeah, if we see a list of just 2 or 3 things, we don't notice it at all. If we see a list of 4 things, sometimes it can jump out at us, but 5 things or more in a list really jumps out as a long list, and it seems like there are a lot of things being listed. So it suggests an overwhelming amount of what the writer is talking about. In addition to looking for the length of coordinate series, also look at the type of coordination being used. Typically, coordinate series use syndeton, or what's called syndetic coordination. Syndeton is just a form of syntactic coordination that you all learned when you were very little, whereby the elements of the list are joined by commas with a coordinating conjunction, and or used before the final element, such as I will have eggs and ham, or I will have coffee, eggs, ham, and toast. That's standard syndeton, and stylistically speaking, standard syndeton is not noticed when read or heard because it's just how we all normally talk or write. Departing, however, from standard syndeton is another way to stylistically draw attention to a coordinate series or list. Yeah, and we have a couple of devices to learn here, starting with asyndeton, which is a non-standard form of coordination in which the final conjunction is omitted. And we have polysyndeton, which is another non-standard form of conjunction in which a conjunction is used to join all the elements on the list. So it replaces all the commas with additional coordinating conjunctions. Here we can illustrate the differences between these. Normal syndeton would read something like, I will have coffee, eggs, ham, and toast, and it's not stylistically notable. That's just how we'd normally write it. Asyndeton, I would say something like, I will have coffee, eggs, ham, toast. And by omitting that last conjunction, stylistically, I'm suggesting a sort of indefiniteness to my list, as though this list could go on forever, or as though I'm just not sure where the list ends. In this particular instance, it sounds like I'm writing a character who's maybe not really paying attention to what they actually want to eat for breakfast. They're just listing off whatever pops into their head. So it suggests this kind of spontaneity and indefiniteness, as though the list could go on, the writer's just not sure. Finally, polysyndeton would read like this. I will have coffee and eggs and ham and toast. Right away, this one's the most kind of jarring to read. It's certainly the slowest to read because of the unnecessary and redundant conjunctions that are in there. But by forcing the use of so many conjunctions, it makes the list sound longer than it actually is because it takes a longer time to read it. It physically slows it down. It also kind of adds an individual weight to each item. It really makes each item stand out in the list. And so this is another technique that is used to kind of add emphasis to something. All right, let's go ahead and complete part C of our practice activity here. Just like you think you will, you'll be identifying and explaining examples of unusual coordinate series in a text. Just like elements of word choice, elements of word arrangement can be used to enhance your rhetorical analysis. Yeah, just like with word choice, you want to focus a rhetorical analysis paragraph on a larger rhetorical technique, some kind of argument, some kind of appeal to character, or some kind of appeal to emotion, but then cite specific word arrangement devices within your text evidence and explain how those devices help enhance the broader rhetorical technique. Here then is a recap of the various devices that we've discussed in this lesson. First of all, repetition. That is a device. If you're not sure what kind of repetition you're looking at, or if it's a kind of repetition that is maybe repeated sporadically through a text and not consistently in any one way, yeah, just call it repetition. No need to force yourself to use one of these Greek terms. However, if you do see a more specific pattern, then call them by their appropriate names. We have anaphora, epistrophe, symplosi, anadiplosis, and epinalepsis. We also learned about parallelism, chiasmus, antithesis, and then asyndeton and polysyndeton. And lastly, here's a paragraph that features some style analysis relating to some word arrangement stylistic devices. Florence Kelley begins her speech by opening her audience's eyes with overwhelming data on the number of child laborers working in America. She spends the first two paragraphs providing statistics, noting that there are 2 million children in the United States, some as young as 6 years old, who are, quote, earning their bread. She adds in paragraph 3 that of all the workers in the U.S., no single group has grown in number more rapidly over the previous 2 decades than have teenage girls. By pointing out the sheer number of children already in the workforce and implying that they will take up a greater and greater percentage of the workforce in the future, Kelley is not only introducing her audience to the issue, but also attempting to shock them into realizing just how serious the issue is. Additionally, when discussing the rise in teenage girls in the workforce, she uses asyndeton, noting that they are in commerce, in offices, in manufacturing. The lack of a conjunction to conclude this list implies that the places girls are now working is endless, further strengthening the intended shock of the realization. Kelley's use of data is designed to overcome her audience's ignorance of the issue. While many of the women in her middle and upper class audience may be abstractly aware that the practice of child labor exists, they have likely never witnessed or experienced it themselves. Therefore, Kelley confronts them with startling numbers in order to help them understand the truth. Once aware of this truth, Kelley's audience will be more likely to adopt the averse attitudes toward the practices that she wants them to hold. Using that model paragraph, go ahead and complete Part D of the practice activity, which asks you to write a rhetorical analysis paragraph that incorporates some of the stylistic elements you learned about in this lesson. Once you've finished with Part D, you are finished with this lesson.